The old house bar stood at the edge of the forest, its weathered wooden planks groaning under the weight of decades. The wind howled through the trees, carrying with it a whisper that sounded almost human. Inside, the air was heavy, thick with the scent of dust and damp wood. A single candle flickered on the windowsill, its flame dancing wildly, casting long, twisting shadows on the walls. The main character, a young woman named Eliza, sat by the window, her knees pulled up to her chest. She stared out into the darkness, her eyes tracing the outlines of the trees as they swayed in the wind. The forest seemed alive tonight, its branches clawing at the sky like skeletal fingers. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there, watching her. Eliza had come to the house to escape the noise of the city, to find some peace and quiet. But this silence was different. It wasn't calming. It was oppressive, like the house itself was holding its breath. The only sounds were the occasional creak of the floorboards and the faint rustling of the curtains as the wind slipped through the cracks in the window frame. She tried to focus on the book in her lap, but her eyes kept darting back to the window. The forest was too dark, too still. Even the animals seemed to have fled, leaving behind an unnatural stillness. Then, the first strange thing happened. A loud creak echoed through the house, as if someone had stepped on a loose floorboard. Eliza froze, her heart pounding in her chest. She listened intently, but there was no follow-up sound, no footsteps, no breathing, just silence. "It's just the house settling," she muttered to herself, though the words did little to calm her nerves. A few minutes later, there was another sound, a soft thud from the hallway. Eliza's eyes darted to the door, her grip tightening on the book. She waited, her breath shallow, but nothing else happened. Then, the picture frame above the fireplace fell. It crashed to the floor with a sound that made Eliza jump, the glass shattering into 1,000 pieces. She stared at the broken frame, her mind racing. There was no draft, no explanation for why it had fallen. The calmness in the room began to feel artificial, like a thin veil hiding something far more sinister. Eliza's skin prickled, and she couldn't shake the sensation that she wasn't alone. The shadows on the walls seemed to shift when she wasn't looking, and the flickering candlelight made the air feel alive, pulsing with an unseen presence. She stood up, her legs trembling, and walked to the fireplace. As she bent down to pick up the broken frame, she noticed something strange. The photo inside was of the house taken decades ago, but in the corner of the image, barely visible, was a figure standing in the window. A figure that hadn't been there when she first hung the picture. Eliza's breath caught in her throat. She dropped the frame and backed away, her eyes fixed on the window. The forest outside seemed darker now, the trees pressing closer to the house. Then a loud bang shattered the silence. It came from outside, near the edge of the forest. Eliza froze, her heart pounding so loudly she could hear it in her ears. The sound was unmistakable. Something heavy had fallen, or been dropped. She stood there, torn between curiosity and fear. Should she go outside and investigate? Or stay inside, where it was safe? Or at least where it felt safe? The wind howled again, and this time it sounded like a voice, whispering her name. "Eliza?" Her blood ran cold. She took a step toward the door, then stopped. The candle on the windowsill flickered once, twice, and then went out, plunging the room into darkness. Outside, something moved in the shadows. Eliza stood in the darkened room, her breath visible in the cold air. The candle's flame had died, leaving her in near total darkness. The only light came from the pale glow of the moon filtering through the window, casting long, jagged shadows across the floor. The bang outside still echoed in her mind, a sound so sharp and deliberate it couldn't be ignored. She hesitated, her hand hovering over the doorknob. Every instinct screamed at her to stay inside, to lock the doors and hide under the covers until morning. But another part of her, a curious, stubborn part, needed to know what had made that noise. Taking a deep breath, she grabbed the flashlight from the table and stepped outside. The night was bitterly cold, the kind of cold that seeped into your bones and made your teeth chatter. The forest loomed ahead, its trees swaying unnaturally as if alive. Eliza frowned. There was no wind now, not even a breeze. Yet the branches twisted and groaned, their movements slow and deliberate, like the arms of some great beast stretching in the dark. She shone the flashlight toward the edge of the forest, the beam cutting through the darkness. The underbrush was thick, the ground covered in a carpet of dead leaves and twisted roots. She took a few cautious steps forward, her boots crunching on the frost-covered grass. That's when she saw it. A doll lay in the dirt, its porcelain face cracked and its eyes missing. Its once fine dress was tattered and stained, and its limbs were twisted at unnatural angles. Eliza's stomach churned as she stared at it. There was something deeply wrong about the doll. Something that made her skin crawl. It didn't belong here, in the middle of nowhere, lying in the dirt like it had been waiting for her. She crouched down, her breath fogging in the cold air. Against her better judgment, she picked up the doll. It was heavier than she expected, its body cold and lifeless. The cracked face seemed to leer at her, its empty eye sockets staring into her soul. "Why are you out here?" she whispered, more to herself than to the doll. The forest seemed to hold its breath, the silence pressing in on her from all sides. She glanced around, the flashlight beam sweeping across the trees. For a moment, she thought she saw something move, a shadow darting between the trunks. But when she looked again, there was nothing. Shivering, she tucked the doll under her arm and hurried back to the house. Inside, the air felt even colder than before. Eliza placed the doll on the kitchen table, its lifeless form staring up at the ceiling. She tried to ignore it as she relit the candle, but the doll's presence was impossible to overlook. It felt like it was watching her, even without eyes. She sat down at the table, her hands trembling as she wrapped them around a mug of tea. The whispers from the forest were louder now, seeping through the walls like a distant, haunting melody. She strained to make out the words, but they were just beyond her understanding, a jumble of sounds that sent chills down her spine. Then she heard it. Eliza? Her name, clear as day, whispered in a voice that was both familiar and alien. She froze, her mug halfway to her lips. The sound had come from outside, but it felt like it was right next to her ear, the breath of the speaker cold against her skin. She set the mug down and stood up, her eyes darting to the window. The forest was a wall of blackness, the trees swaying gently despite the lack of wind. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, and she could have sworn she saw shapes moving in the shadows. Figures darting between the trees, their forms indistinct but undeniably there. The feeling of being watched was overwhelming now. Eliza backed away from the window, her heart pounding. She turned to the doll on the table, and for a moment she thought it had moved. Its head was tilted slightly to the side. Its cracked lips curled into a faint smile. "No," she muttered, shaking her head. "It's just my imagination." But the whispers didn't stop. They grew louder, more frantic, until they were almost deafening. And then she heard it. A sound that made her blood run cold. Footsteps. They came from upstairs, slow and deliberate. The creak of the floorboards unmistakable. Eliza's breath caught in her throat. She was alone in the house. She knew she was. But the footsteps were real, and they were moving toward the staircase. She grabbed the flashlight, her hands shaking so badly she could barely hold it. The whispers outside grew to a crescendo, and the doll on the table seemed to vibrate with an unseen energy. The footsteps reached the top of the stairs. Eliza's mind raced. Should she run? Hide? Confront whatever was up there? Her legs felt like they were rooted to the floor. Her body paralyzed with fear. And then the footsteps began to descend. The whispers had become a constant presence, a low, insidious hum that followed Eliza wherever she went. They were in the walls, in the air, in her mind. She tried to ignore them, to convince herself it was just the wind or her imagination. But the voices were too clear, too deliberate. They spoke in fragments, in languages she didn't understand, but their intent was unmistakable. They wanted her attention. Doors began to slam shut on their own, the sound echoing through the house like gunshots. Eliza would turn a corner and find a door closed, even though she was certain she had left it open. The mirrors were worse. She avoided them as much as she could, but sometimes she couldn't help catching a glimpse of her reflection, or what she thought was her reflection. The figure in the mirror moved when she didn't. Its eyes hollow and its mouth twisted into a cruel smile. The doll, still sitting on the kitchen table, seemed to be the source of it all. Eliza had tried to throw it away, but every time she did, it would reappear in the house, on the couch, on the stairs, even in her bed. Its cracked face and empty eye sockets seemed to mock her, as if it knew something she didn't. One evening, as the whispers grew louder and the doors slammed with increasing frequency, Eliza noticed something strange about the old bookshelf in the living room. It was slightly ajar, as if it had been moved. She approached it cautiously, her flashlight in hand. When she pulled on the edge of the shelf, it creaked open to reveal a hidden staircase leading down into darkness. The air that wafted up from the staircase was damp and cold, carrying with it the scent of mildew and decay. Eliza hesitated at the top of the stairs, her heart pounding. Every instinct told her to turn back, to close the bookshelf, and pretend she had never seen it. But curiosity, or something darker, pulled her forward. She descended the stairs slowly, the wooden steps groaning under her weight. The basement was vast, its walls lined with strange, ancient symbols carved into the stone. The symbols seemed to pulse faintly in the dim light, as if alive. The air was thick with an oppressive energy, making it hard to breathe. In the corner of the basement sat an old chest, its surface covered in dust and cobwebs. Eliza approached it cautiously, her flashlight beam trembling as it illuminated the intricate carvings on the lid. The carvings depicted scenes of horror, figures writhing in agony, forests consumed by fire, and a grotesque pumpkin with a gaping, blood-stained mouth. With trembling hands, she opened the chest. Inside was a journal, Its pages yellowed with age. She picked it up and began to read, her eyes scanning the cramped, spidery handwriting. The journal told of a curse tied to the forest and to her family. It spoke of a creature known as the bloodsucker, a monstrous entity that fed on the lifeblood of the living. The creature was bound to the forest, its power tied to an ancient ritual that had gone wrong. The journal warned that the bloodsucker could only be summoned by those of the bloodline, and once awakened, it would not stop until it had consumed every soul in its path. Eliza's hands shook as she turned the pages, her mind reeling. The journal mentioned her family by name, tracing their lineage back to the original ritual. It spoke of sacrifices, of blood spilled in the forest, and of a doll, a vessel used to contain the creature's essence. Her eyes darted to the doll upstairs, and a cold dread settled in her chest. Before she could process what she had read, a scream shattered the silence. It came from upstairs, high-pitched and filled with terror. Eliza dropped the journal and bolted up the stairs, her heart racing. She burst into the living room, her flashlight beam sweeping across the room. The scream had come from her bedroom. She ran up the stairs, her legs burning with effort. When she reached her bedroom door, she froze. The doll was sitting on her bed, its cracked face turned toward her. Its empty eye sockets seemed to stare straight into her soul, and its lips were curled into a faint, knowing smile. The whispers grew louder, filling the room with their cacophony. Eliza's breath came in short, panicked gasps as she backed away from the door. The doll tilted its head, its movements slow and deliberate. And then it spoke. The forest had become an obsession. Eliza could feel it pulling at her, a magnetic force that tugged at her very soul. The whispers, now constant and deafening, seemed to originate from deep within the trees. They called her name over and over, in voices that were both familiar and alien. She tried to resist, to stay inside where it felt safe, or at least safer. But the doll's presence in the house was unbearable. It sat on her bed, unmoving but always watching, its cracked face twisted into that faint, knowing smile. The journal's words echoed in her mind, a relentless reminder of the curse that bound her family to the forest. One night, she could take it no longer. She packed a flashlight, a knife, and a small bag of supplies, and stepped out into the cold, moonless night. The forest loomed ahead, its trees towering and ancient. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and decaying leaves. As she stepped into the tree line, the whispers grew louder, more insistent. The flashlight beam cut through the darkness, but the shadows seemed to press in from all sides, alive and hungry. The trees were wrong. Their bark was gnarled and twisted, their branches reaching out like skeletal fingers. As Eliza walked deeper into the forest, she began to notice faces in the trunks, faces carved by nature or something more sinister. Their expressions were twisted in agony, their hollow eyes following her every move. She tried to focus on the path ahead, but the force. Then she heard it. Children laughing. The sound was high-pitched and carefree, but it sent a chill down her spine. She turned, her flashlight beam sweeping across the trees. The laughter came from all directions, echoing through the forest like a cruel joke. But there was no one there. No children, no signs of life. Just the endless oppressive darkness. Eliza's breath came in short, panicked gasps as she pressed forward. The laughter grew louder, more manic, until it was almost deafening. She covered her ears, but the sound seeped into her mind, twisting her thoughts into knots. Finally, she reached a clearing. In the center of the clearing was a circle of stones, each one taller than she was. The stones were covered in strange carvings, symbols that matched those in the basement. The air here was colder, the whispers louder. Eliza's flashlight beam flickered as she approached the circle, her heart pounding in her chest. That's when she saw it. A shadowy figure stood behind the stones, its form indistinct but undeniably there. It didn't move, didn't speak, but Eliza could feel its gaze on her, cold and unyielding. The whispers grew to a crescendo, the voices overlapping in a chaotic symphony of fear and despair. Eliza's hands trembled as she gripped the flashlight. "Who are you?" she called out, her voice barely above a whisper. The figure didn't respond. It simply stood there, watching. Then it began to move. It stepped forward, its movements slow and deliberate. Eliza's breath caught in her throat as she backed away, her flashlight beam flickering wildly. The figure's form became clearer as it approached. A tall, gaunt shape with hollow eyes and a mouth that seemed to stretch too wide. The whispers turned into screams, the voices of the forest crying out in unison. Eliza's flashlight flickered once, twice, and then died, plunging her into complete darkness. She stumbled backward, her heart racing. The figure was close now, so close she could feel its cold breath on her skin. She turned and ran, her boots sinking into the soft, fleshy ground. The laughter returned, louder and more manic than before, echoing through the trees as she fled. The forest seemed to close in around her, the trees twisting and shifting to block her path. She tripped over a root and fell, her hands sinking into the damp earth. When she looked up, she saw them. Dozens of shadowy figures, their hollow eyes glowing in the darkness. They surrounded her, their forms shifting and writhing like smoke. Eliza's breath came in ragged gasps as she scrambled to her feet, her mind screaming at her to run, to fight, to do anything. But there was no escape. The figures closed in, their whispers merging into a single, deafening roar. Eliza's vision blurred as the darkness consumed her, the forest's laughter ringing in her ears. And then, silence. Eliza ran blindly through the forest, her heart pounding in her chest. The shadowy figures had vanished as suddenly as they appeared, but their presence lingered, a cold, oppressive weight on her soul. The forest seemed to close in around her, the trees twisting and groaning as if alive. She didn't know how long she ran, but eventually she stumbled into a small clearing. In the center stood an abandoned cabin, its wooden walls warped and rotting. The windows were shattered, and the door hung crookedly on its hinges. The air around the cabin was heavy, thick with the scent of decay and something metallic. Blood. Eliza hesitated at the edge of the clearing, her breath coming in ragged gasps. The whispers had grown quieter here, replaced by an eerie silence that felt almost worse. The cabin seemed to pulse with a dark energy, as if it were alive and waiting for her. Against her better judgment, she approached the cabin. The door creaked open with a gentle push, revealing a dim, dusty interior. The walls were covered in old, dried blood, the dark stains forming strange, almost ritualistic patterns. The floor was littered with debris, broken furniture, shattered glass, and what looked like animal bones. In the center of the room was a small table, its surface covered in a thick layer of dust. On the table lay a diary, its cover cracked and stained. Eliza picked it up, her hands trembling as she opened it to the first page. The diary belonged to someone named Thomas, a man who had lived in the cabin decades ago. His handwriting was frantic, the ink smudged and faded in places. He wrote of a curse, the same curse Eliza had read about in the journal from the basement. He spoke of the forest, of the whispers, and of the shadowy figures that haunted him. "They're coming for me," Thomas wrote. "I can hear them under the floor, scratching and clawing. They want me to open the door, but I can't. I won't. God help me. I won't." Eliza's breath caught in her throat as she read the words. The diary went on to describe Thomas's descent into madness, his futile attempts to escape the forest, and his eventual disappearance. The last entry was barely legible. The words scrawled in a shaky hand. "It's too late. They're here. They're inside." As Eliza closed the diary, a sound broke the silence. A faint scratching, coming from under the floor. She froze, her heart pounding. The sound grew louder, more insistent, until it was impossible to ignore. She knelt down and began to pry up the wooden planks, her hands shaking with fear and anticipation. The wood was old and rotten, coming apart easily. Beneath the floor was a tunnel, its walls lined with jagged stones and its depths shrouded in darkness. The whispers returned, louder now, urging her to enter the tunnel. Eliza hesitated, her mind screaming at her to turn back, to run as far away as she could. But something pulled her forward, a force she couldn't resist. She climbed down into the tunnel, her flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. The air was damp and cold, the walls slick with moisture. The tunnel was filled with horrifying sights. Bones of animals, some small, some disturbingly large, litter the ground. Claw marks score the walls, deep and jagged, as if something had tried to claw its way out. The whispers grew louder as she went deeper, the voices overlapping in a chaotic symphony of fear and despair. The tunnel seemed to stretch on forever, the walls pressing in around her. Finally, she reached the end of the tunnel. There, in the wall, was a door. It was old and heavy, its surface covered in the same strange carvings she had seen in the basement and on the stones in the forest. The door pulsed faintly, as if it were alive, and a low, rhythmic thud emanated from behind it, like the beating of a heart. Eliza's breath came in short, panicked gasps as she stared at the door. The whispers grew to a deafening roar, the voices screaming at her to open it, to let them out. She reached out, her hand trembling as it hovered over the door's handle. The air was thick with tension, the tunnel itself seeming to hold its breath. And then the door began to open on its own. The door creaked open slowly, its hinges groaning as if they hadn't moved in centuries. Beyond it lay a vast open space, bathed in a pale bluish glow that seemed to emanate from nowhere and everywhere at once. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and something metallic, like blood. Eliza hesitated at the threshold, her heart pounding in her chest. The whispers were deafening now, a cacophony of voices that overlapped and intertwined, creating a symphony of fear and despair. They pulled at her, urging her to step inside. Against her better judgment, she did. The walls of the chamber were covered in the same strange symbols she had seen before, but these seemed to move, writhing and shifting like living things. The pale light cast long, twisting shadows that danced across the floor, creating the illusion of movement where there was none. As she stepped further into the chamber, ghostly figures began to appear. They materialized out of the shadows, their forms translucent and flickering like candle flames. Some were crying, their faces twisted in anguish, while others screamed silently, their mouths open in soundless agony. They pointed at Eliza, their hollow eyes filled with accusation and blame. "Why are you doing this?" she whispered, her voice trembling. "What do you want from me?" The figures didn't respond. They simply continued to point, their silent screams echoing in her mind. Then, the memories came. They flooded her mind like a dam breaking. Images and sensations she had buried deep within her subconscious. She saw herself as a child, standing in the forest with her family. They were gathered around a circle of stones, their faces solemn and grim. In the center of the circle was a doll, the same doll that now haunted her. Her father held a knife, its blade glinting in the moonlight. He spoke words she couldn't understand, his voice low and guttural. The air was thick with tension, the forest itself seeming to hold its breath. Then, the sacrifice. Eliza's breath caught in her throat as the memory played out before her eyes. She had been a part of it, a willing participant in a ritual meant to appease the bloodsucker. The doll had been the vessel, the conduit through which the creature's essence was bound. But something had gone wrong. The memory shifted, the scene dissolving into chaos. The forest had come alive, the trees twisting and groaning as the bloodsucker emerged from the shadows. It had been too powerful, too hungry. Her family had fled, leaving the doll behind, its cracked face staring up at the sky with hollow eyes. Eliza fell to her knees, her mind reeling. The memories were too much, too vivid. She had buried them for a reason, had convinced herself they were just nightmares. But now, they were real, and they were tearing her apart. The ghostly figures closed in around her, their silent screams growing louder in her mind. The whispers became a roar, the voices screaming her name over and over, almost deafening in their intensity. "Eliza? Eliza? Eliza?" She covered her ears, but the sound was inside her head, a relentless cacophony that threatened to drive her mad. The walls of the chamber seemed to close in around her, the symbols writhing and twisting like living things. And then she realized the truth. She was trapped. The door she had come through was gone, replaced by a solid wall of stone. The chamber was a prison, a labyrinth of horrors designed to break her mind and soul. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, their voices merging into a single, deafening scream. "Eliza!" she screamed back, her voice lost in the chaos. The ghostly figures reached for her, their cold, translucent hands brushing against her skin. The memories continued to flood her mind, each one more horrifying than the last. And then the final memory came, the bloodsucker, its grotesque form towering over her, its jagged mouth dripping with crimson sap. It had been waiting for her, biding its time. And now it had her. The whispers grew to a crescendo, the voices screaming her name one last time before falling silent. The chamber was still, the ghostly figures frozen in place. Eliza's breath came in ragged gasps as she stared into the darkness, her mind teetering on the edge of madness. And then the door reappeared. It stood at the far end of the chamber, its surface pulsating with a faint, rhythmic thud. The whispers returned, softer now, urging her to open it. Eliza's hands trembled as she reached for the handle. The air was thick with tension, the chamber itself seeming to hold its breath. And then she turned the handle. The door swung open, revealing an abyss of pure darkness. Eliza stepped through, her heart pounding in her chest. The air was thick and heavy, pressing down on her like a physical weight. The whispers returned, louder and more insistent than ever, their voices overlapping in a chaotic symphony of fear and despair. The ground beneath her feet was sticky, clinging to her boots with every step. She tried to run, but the darkness seemed to close in around her, the shadows twisting and writhing like living things. The whispers grew louder, their voices now clear and distinct. "You did this," they hissed. "This is your fault." Eliza's breath came in short, panicked gasps as she stumbled through the darkness. The voices accused her, blamed her for the curse, for the horrors that had befallen her family and the forest. She tried to block them out, but they seeped into her mind, twisting her thoughts and memories. "You were there," the voices whispered. "You were a part of it." The memories flooded back, more vivid and horrifying than before. She saw herself as a child, standing in the forest with her family. The ritual, the sacrifice, the bloodsucker emerging from the shadows. She had been a part of it, a willing participant in the curse that now haunted her. "No," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I didn't know. I didn't understand." But the voices didn't care. They continued to accuse her, their words cutting deeper with each passing moment. Eliza's mind reeled, her thoughts spiraling out of control. She began to question her own memories, her own sanity. "What's real?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. "What's true?" The darkness seemed to pulse around her, the shadows closing in. She felt a cold, clammy hand brush against her skin, sending a shiver down her spine. The whispers grew louder, more frantic, until they were almost deafening. And then a figure emerged from the darkness. It was tall and gaunt, its form shifting and writhing like smoke. Its eyes glowed with a faint, otherworldly light, and its mouth was twisted into a cruel smile. Eliza's breath caught in her throat as the figure approached, its movements slow and deliberate. "Eliza," it said, its voice a low, guttural growl. "You've been running for so long, but you can't escape the truth." She backed away, her heart pounding in her chest. "Who are you?" The figure tilted its head, its glowing eyes boring into hers. "I'm a part of your past, a piece of the curse you helped create. And now, you must face the consequences." Eliza's mind raced, her thoughts a jumbled mess of fear and confusion. "What do you want from me?" The figure smiled, its teeth glinting in the darkness. "I offer you a choice. Stay here in the darkness and suffer for eternity, or do something terrible, something unthinkable to break the curse." Eliza's breath came in short, panicked gasps as she stared at the figure. "What do you mean? What do I have to do?" The figure leaned in closer, its breath cold against her skin. "You must make a sacrifice, a life for a life. Only then will the curse be broken." Eliza's mind reeled, the weight of the figure's words pressing down on her. She thought of her family, of the forest, of the horrors she had witnessed. She thought of the doll, the whispers, the ghostly figures. And then she thought of herself. The figure's smile widened, its eyes glowing with a cruel, knowing light. "Choose wisely, Eliza. Your time is running out." The darkness seemed to pulse around her, the shadows closing in. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, until they were almost deafening. And then the figure vanished, leaving Eliza alone in the darkness. The darkness seemed to press in on Eliza from all sides, suffocating and relentless. The whispers had grown into a deafening roar, their voices overlapping in a chaotic symphony of fear and despair. She knelt on the sticky, pulsating ground, her hands clutching her head as the memories flooded back, each one more vivid and horrifying than the last. She remembered it all now. Her family had made a deal with something evil long ago, something ancient and hungry. They had sought power, protection, and prosperity. But the price had been steep. The bloodsucker, a monstrous entity bound to the forest, had demanded a sacrifice, a life for a life, a soul for a soul. And Eliza had been the final part of that deal. She saw herself as a child, standing in the forest with her family. The ritual, the chanting, the knife in her father's hand. She had been too young to understand, too innocent to realize what was happening. But now, the truth was clear. She had been chosen, marked by the curse, and her family had sealed her fate. The whispers grew louder, their voices merging into a single, deafening scream. "You were the sacrifice," they hissed. "You were the key." Eliza's breath came in short, panicked gasps as she struggled to process the truth. Her family had betrayed her, had sold her soul to the bloodsucker in exchange for their own survival. And now, the curse had come full circle, demanding its due. The darkness around her began to shift, the shadows twisting and writhing like living things. A figure emerged from the abyss, its form tall and gaunt, its eyes glowing with a faint, otherworldly light. It was the bloodsucker, its grotesque form towering over her, its jagged mouth dripping with crimson sap. "Eliza?" it said, its voice a low, guttural growl. "You remember now, don't you?" She nodded, her voice trembling. "I remember." The bloodsucker smiled, its teeth glinting in the darkness. "Good, then you know why you're here." Eliza's mind raced, her thoughts a jumbled mess of fear and desperation. "What do you want from me?" The bloodsucker leaned in closer, its breath cold against her skin. "I offer you freedom, Eliza, a chance to break the curse and end the suffering. But it will come at a cost." She stared into its glowing eyes, her heart pounding in her chest. "What cost?" The bloodsucker's smile widened, its jagged mouth twisting into a cruel grin. "You must make a choice. Stay here, in the darkness, and suffer for eternity, or take another's life, a soul to replace yours, and break the curse." Eliza's breath caught in her throat, the weight of the bloodsucker's words pressing down on her. She thought of her family, of the forest, of the horrors she had witnessed. She thought of the doll, the whispers, the ghostly figures, and then she thought of herself. The bloodsucker's eyes glowed with a cruel, knowing light. "Choose wisely, Eliza. Your time is running out." The darkness seemed to pulse around her, the shadows closing in. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, until they were almost deafening. Eliza's mind raced, her thoughts spiraling out of control. She thought of the people she had left behind, of the life she had tried to build. She thought of the innocent souls who would suffer if she didn't act. And then, she made her choice. Eliza stumbled out of the forest, her breath ragged and her clothes torn. The sun was rising, casting a pale, golden light over the trees. But the warmth didn't reach her. She felt cold, hollow, as if something vital had been ripped from her chest. The forest had let her go, or so it seemed. But as she walked back to the house, she couldn't shake the feeling that she wasn't alone. The whispers followed her, their voices faint but insistent, like the buzzing of flies in her ears. Shadows moved at the edges of her vision, twisting and writhing like living things. She turned to look, but there was never anything there. The house loomed ahead, its windows dark and lifeless. It felt different now, colder and more oppressive, as if the walls themselves were watching her. She hesitated at the door, her hand trembling as she reached for the handle. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of dust and decay. The doll was gone, its cracked face and hollow eyes nowhere to be seen. But strange things still happened. Doors slammed shut on their own. The whispers grew louder at night, and the shadows seemed to move when she wasn't looking. Eliza tried to convince herself it was all in her head, that the horrors of the forest had left her shaken and paranoid. But deep down, she knew the truth. The curse wasn't broken. It had followed her home. Days turned into weeks, and the whispers grew louder. They spoke to her in the dead of night, their voices overlapping in a chaotic symphony of fear and despair. The shadows became more persistent, their forms shifting and writhing like smoke. Eliza's sleep was plagued by nightmares, vivid and horrifying, each one more terrifying than the last. She tried to carry on with her life, to pretend everything was normal. But the house felt colder and darker with each passing day, its walls closing in around her. The whispers followed her everywhere, their voices a constant reminder of the horrors she had faced. And then, one night, she saw it. Eliza stood in front of the mirror, her reflection pale and gaunt. The whispers were louder than ever, their voices screaming in her ears. She stared into the mirror, her breath fogging the glass, and that's when she saw it. A shadow standing right behind her. It was tall and gaunt, its form shifting and writhing like smoke. Its eyes glowed with a faint, otherworldly light, and its mouth was twisted into a cruel smile. Eliza's breath caught in her throat as she turned to look, but there was nothing there. When she turned back to the mirror, the shadow was still there, its glowing eyes boring into hers. The whispers grew to a crescendo, their voices merging into a single, deafening scream. And then, the mirror cracked, the glass splintering into 1,000 pieces. Eliza stumbled back, her heart pounding in her chest. The whispers fell silent, the shadows still. But the cold remained, a constant, oppressive weight on her soul. She knew then that the curse wasn't broken. It had followed her home, and it would never let her go. The end